Right, time for a little summary of the charcoal demo we just finished. So in the start I go over the setup. It's the side-size style setup that I used in the bark demo as well. We have a laser print of two A4 sized prints that are stitched together in the middle to give us a little bit of a larger picture. The point was to sort of demonstrate that you don't need to have a extremely fine art studio setup, that you can actually make a nice drawing out of it if you just use the concepts. And of course you can always refer to the picture from your phone or your computer, tablet or something like that if you need to really look at some details. But this is plenty good for side size. In the construct stage, which is the next stage, we want to find first the outlines and we want to think about the placement of the image as well. I recommend you do the construct stage and the following stages on a transfer paper, which is just any kind of paper. You can use graphite to draw on this, or you can use charcoal, whichever you feel like is nicer. You can get a feel for charcoal already on the transfer paper. And once you finish the construct and articulation stages, you will be able to transfer it to a clean, nice charcoal paper. So in the construct stage, we want to draw with straight lines mostly. We just want to find the overall big outline for the drawing. We can use some curves, we can find a little bit of details, but we don't want to get too nitty-gritty with the outline yet. We need more information before we can make those final little decisions, and those will be basically in the rendering stage instead of the articulation stage. After the construct of the outline, we do the construct of the shadow shapes, and we want to also map those in loosely, and then we fill those with a little bit of tone so we can better judge the shapes. Some tone helps us further our accuracy as opposed to just using lines. Once we've toned those in, then we go into the articulation stage. And in the articulation stage, we start breaking those straight lines, slight curves into more accurate representations of the thing we're seeing. With shadow shapes, we want to remember that any form shadows, we want to still have a soft edge on those. If we're doing the transfer drawing, in this demo I did not do that to save some time for myself, but also I have the confidence to just move along with the drawing, and I'm not really scared of messing up the drawing that much because I felt it was, in my comfort zone basically. But for any beginner students, I recommend the transfer drawing. After the articulation of the outline and the shadow shapes, you would then be transferring your drawing to a new charcoal paper, and that would be then nice and clean, no searching marks, no smudges from the previous stages. So basically after the transfer, you start with the grouping of the darks stage. We start that by finding our darkest dark first. In this case, we use the soft pastel actually instead of charcoal for the very darkest dark. It's a Rembrandt brand soft pastel in this case, and it's a nice way to expand the value range a little bit. It sort of becomes a multimedia piece instead of a charcoal piece, but it's still mainly charcoal, of course, and it's just these little accents that we're basically utilizing. The downside of using those is they don't really blend together very well, so you need to really think ahead and plan where you're gonna put down those Rembrandt soft pastel marks. You could use probably Conte pencils or something else like compressed charcoal with some binder to really get those darker marks to stick. In the grouping of the dark stage, so we start with that darkest dark accent, and then we start working on the internal information of the shadows. So we tone in full black, basically as dark as the charcoal goes within the skull's shadows in this case, and then we look for the average value of those shadows, and we first tone it dark and then we work it with the sponge tool in order to sort of really work it in the paper. We get a nicer, cleaner result usually that way rather than just hatching in the tone. So we work in a reverse type of way. Basically, we first go very dark and then we start taking charcoal off little by little. And yeah, the reason being it leaves a nice surface. And first we do the internal areas, and we want to make those pretty close to the average value of each area. So that way when we start actually massing in the background, then we won't lose all our hard-earned drawing that we've just maybe transferred and worked hard for. Because if we have these areas of shadow on shadow, then we'll be losing all the outlines if we don't first lighten the internal shadows that we did first. So the order of operations is pretty important here. So we then work the darker background tones with the larger sponge. The larger sponge, it's similar, it's the literal same sponge material we used in the smaller tool, which is just a piece taped onto a brush end, and it just allows us to work a larger area with the sponge, pushing in the charcoal and also lightening it slightly as we go. creates that nice flat tone. So after we've placed all the dark tones, we've established our shadows, we've placed some of the background tones, we've established background in light, background in shadow, table in light, table in shadow, all this kind of stuff. Then we have enough information that we can start working on the big form modeling on the skull. And on the skull, it basically means we're working with this egg shape kind of thing, or you could say a sphere, or you could even break it down into multiple parts. You know, the muzzle of the mouth could be a cylinder kind of shape. But the most simple way to do it is just sort of imagine an egg in similar lighting and sort of use that as your guide. And actually for that, I used an image of a golf ball that I set up in my studio in the same lighting. So, and that is because I didn't have an egg lying around. I checked the fridge and there were none, so the golf ball had to do. After the big form modeling, we enter the variation of the dark stage. The variation of the dark stage is a quite extensive stage in charcoal because we're working effectively almost the entire drawing a little bit in this stage, especially in the case of the skull where we had to leave the information for the teeth to this stage basically because we wanted to work the big form on the skull as a whole instead of working the form little by little in these small shapes we established. That would have been very messy and would have basically required us to fix everything afterwards anyway, so it was sort of a strategic decision to leave the drawing of the teeth for this stage. In the variation stage, it's about fixing the drawing and working the variations. The drawing usually gets messed up a little bit with the previous stages of the grouping and big form modeling because charcoal tends to move around a lot. That's a good thing as well as a bad thing. It's easy to nudge things over, but also you could sort of end up losing your drawing a little bit in the stages depending on how much you take care with those or how much you fix as you go along. So first we fix the drawing, then we start looking at the internal shadow information. We're not rendering the shadows, but we will find the average sort of areas of the tone in the shadows. We can soften them a little bit, but we don't have to. But effectively, we want to take the shadows into a place where we can mostly just clean things up, soften things a little bit in the finishing stage, instead of really finding new information. And included in the variation stage is finding a gradation for the background as well as the tabletop and also the reflected light of the skull on the table as well, and also the highlight on the table front. After the variations of the dark stage, we enter the planes of light stage. The planes of light stage, basically it's a 3-stage process, but you can of course move around a little bit as you need. First you find the lightest planes in the lightest areas of the form. We don't have many of those because we're working in drawing. We don't really save, a tone for the lightest planes. But in this case, charcoal tends to be messy and you might have some dust left over from all the previous stages that gets into the lights of the paper. So it's a good idea to sort of look at the lightest areas of your drawing and try to see if you can lighten those further. If you can, great, then you've found some light planes. If not, then just move to the next stage, which is the dark planes in the dark areas of the form. So you're first looking next to the shadows and the skull in the lower parts as well as the left parts of the image, and you're looking if there's some things you could darken further in order to really emphasize the form modeling. And once you've done those, then you start looking for those nice exception planes. And we do this last because we want to have context for the exception planes. We don't want to work hard at the big form modeling and then, put a super dark thing in the middle of the lightest part of the form or lighten something to paper white right next to the shadow. In this example, we would use the jaw where there's a pretty big light area right next to the almost darkest areas of the image. We don't want to do that because that just simply destroys the 3D effect we've strived hard to create. So now that we have context, we want to make those things just have enough contrast to read correct, but we don't want to copy the value of the plane exactly. So we need that context to really evaluate accurately. And there's quite a few exception planes in this one, but the key is to just play down the contrast usually and it will be fine. A thing to remember in the planes of light stage is that the big form modeling is there to do some work for us. We already established the 3-dimensional form. We don't want to cover up all of that with new planes or erase all of that. A good rule of thumb is to not cover more than 50% of your big form modeling with new planes. Otherwise it's just a little bit redundant as a stage. After the planes of light, we're ready to start rendering. The goal of rendering the lights is basically just finding all those transitions in those planes. We want to correct the drawing of each plane. We want to check the values. We want to then check the transitions. So it's like a 3-part process as well. First, we check the shape, then the value, and then the transitions. If you're thinking that it's hard to identify these planes, you can always try to put a name to the shape of that plane. Maybe it looks like a triangle, maybe it looks like a dinosaur or a dog or something like this. But if you can name it, then it's easier to compare. So you can use that to your advantage. After we render the lights, then we finally go into the darks. The darks, we want to start rendering the internal information in the skull, and first you sort of clean those out, make everything softer. Also try to tackle the edges that are in relation to the background in shadow as well. And finally you move to the background and the tabletop. Those are exercises in patience, and also their point is basically to hone your eye, as you want to create gradation from one value to the next, but you want to get rid of all that messy stuff, basically. That is the paper texture and the darker marks and lighter worm things that are sort of visible due to the texture of the paper. And it is optional. It does create a more refined drawing, but I think it's a bit of a rite of passage, you could say, to sort of go through really rendering a background in charcoal. And it's not really just about, you know, doing it for its own sake. It really does like hone your eye to the next level when you spend a few days just staring at black stuff on black and you try to make it a really flat, even tone. My own experience is that when I was working on my first charcoal project in school, it was more or less the third day when I was working on that background that I really started seeing like the subtleties of value a lot better, and I've been seeing them ever since. So I think it's a very useful thing to do once or twice, but perhaps for me it's not necessary to render the background just for my own sake. But I did render the highlight on the table in order to demonstrate a little bit how that goes. Alright, so that's it for this one. This was around 20 hours of demonstration condensed into, I don't know, something like 7 hours of edited footage. So this little summary will never like cover all the little tidbits of information I shared during the long process, but it should be enough to get you started. If you want more information, I would just look through the entire process. You can listen to it even as a podcast or something if you just want to find the little bits of information I dropped in there. And all right, thanks to anyone who's actually going through the course right now. I really appreciate it.